Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Deutchman. I'm the Executive Director at the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. Welcome to our second Speech Spotlight Live. For those of you who tuned in last month with President Drake or have joined us at other center programming, welcome back. If you are new to the UC National Center, we are happy to have you. I'm certain today will be a fascinating conversation with our three dynamic speakers. So deplatforming is one of the words on the tip of everyone's tongues these days. We have been inundated with coverage of social media companies banning former President Trump and others from their platforms following the January 6th insurrection. This in turn has led to questions about how powerful tech companies are and should be, the best methods for moderating content, the impact of Section 230, and the values and role of the First Amendment. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to review a basic principle of constitutional law. The First Amendment was written to constrain government power. It states, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. The term Congress, as many of you know, has been interpreted to mean federal, state, or local government and includes public institutions like the University of California. It is generally agreed upon by legal scholars that Twitter, Facebook, and other social media companies are not public institutions, and therefore, when they decide to deplatform someone, the First Amendment does not apply to them. So keep that in mind as we discuss. Please feel free to enter questions into the Q&A, and I'll do my best to integrate them into our discussion. And without further ado, let me introduce you to our distinguished panel. First, we have Genevieve Lakier, who is an assistant professor of law and a Herbert and Marjorie Fried teaching scholar at the University of Chicago. Genevieve's research explores the connections between culture and law. She's currently engaged in a long-term project exploring the cultural history of the First Amendment and another project exploring the changing role of the state in the regulation of sex. Genevieve has an AB from Princeton University, a JD from New York University School of Law, and an MA and PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago. Chris Lewis is president and CEO of Public Knowledge, I think also known as PK. Prior to being elevated to this role, Chris served as PK's VP from 2012 to 2019, where he led the organization's day-to-day advocacy and political strategy on Capitol Hill and at government agencies. Before joining Public Knowledge, Chris worked in the FCC Office of Legislative Affairs, including as its deputy director. He's the former US Senate staffer for the late Senator Edward Kennedy and has over 18 years of political organizing and advocacy experience. He graduated from Harvard University with a bachelor's degree in government. And last, but certainly not least, is Ben Wizner, who is the director of the ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. For nearly 15 years, he's worked at the intersection of civil liberties and national security, litigating numerous cases involving airport security policies, government watch lists, surveillance practices, targeted killing, and torture. Since July 2013, he has been the principal legal advisor to NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. He's a graduate of Harvard College and New York University School of Law, and he was a clerk to the Honorable Stephen Reinhardt of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. I want to thank each of our panelists for joining us today. So to kick it off, as I talked about in our introduction, deplatforming is kind of the word du jour and everyone's talking about it. But I thought maybe we should take a little step back before we talk about what's happened in the last couple months and whether that was a good choice or not, and really have maybe Ben just maybe define deplatforming and maybe just give a little context for how it's been used in the past.
Thanks for that very warm introduction. I don't know that deplatforming has a working definition. I was thinking about this before today. In fact, I think some people use it pejoratively and other people use it admiringly. When they say deplatforming, it's working. It's not like a word like censorship where it conveys that, this sort of negative feeling that we have towards it. Someone is trying to control what we see or think. Deplatforming really is this neutral word, but I think I take it to mean, actions predominantly by private entities that have the effect of either removing or diminishing amplification of speech. So you could think about something like the Hollywood Red Scare, where Hollywood writers who were involved with communism were basically, not necessarily directly through government action, but by private Hollywood studios, prevented from being able to make a living or to speak through their art. You could think about what happened to the Dixie Chicks when, during the fervor after 9/11 and the run-up to the Iraq War, they made the mistake of criticizing former President Bush in the great state of Texas. And then as a result, had many of their appearances canceled, weren't played on the radio. Obviously, social media has really defined the term, I think, the way in its modern usage. And it refers most commonly to social media platforms, and particularly the most dominant social media platforms, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, deciding to exercise their right to remove either a person or their speech from their platforms.
Great. Thank you. That's super helpful. Genevieve or Chris, do either of you want to add anything to that kind of context? Okay, Genevieve, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting, Ben, that you were saying people don't quite know what it means or it's a new term, because I've had a lot of discussions with friends and colleagues about the word, because it's one of my favorite words, and it's kind of an awkward, long word. And so I think this view is somewhat idiosyncratic. But the thing I like about the idea of deplatforming, or the word, is that it recognizes that even if we're thinking just about private people participate in what we think of as the marketplace of ideas in all different kinds of ways. So people speak and they participate in the marketplace of ideas, they read or they listen, they're consumers. But then there's also a whole set of private actors like the social media companies that provide a platform for others to speak. And when those others speak, they don't associate themselves with that speech. They're simply providing them space, just like the government provides space by opening up the public parks and sidewalks. And so deplatforming, I think, is pointing to that particular social relationship where one person is providing a platform, a space, physical space, virtual space for another to speak, and therefore gaining the power to decide the terms under which that other person speaks. So deplatforming, I think, is the choice by usually a private actor to kick someone off the platform. And although it's associated with social media companies, I completely agree, there's a long history of deplatforming in this country. I mean, we can go all the way back, if we're going to include the government, to the decisions in the 1830s by local postmaster generals to not allow any abolitionist magazines or newspapers to circulate in the US mails in order to preserve the status quo, the pro-slavery status quo at the time. Or the decision by Western Union and the Associated Press in the 1880s and the 1890s to not allow any newspapers that criticized either of those corporations to gain access to the telegraph wires. Or the decisions in the 1930s by the National Association of Broadcasters, which represented the 500 largest radio broadcasters in the country, to not allow any union voices, any labor groups on air, a decision that the ACLU at the time strongly protested. So, you know, we often think that the difficult questions raised by social media today are unique to have never been raised before, but in fact, there's lots of historical antecedents.
I love that. Thank you. I mean, if it weren't for our audience of almost 100 people, I might just talk only about the definition and history of deplatforming. Chris, I don't know if you have anything to add on that. Otherwise, I have another question for you. You know, look, many people have been calling for platforms and media outlets to prevent Trump and others, right, from disseminating false information for quite some time. So I was wondering if you could speak to why you think it took something as significant, you know, as a capital insurrection for platforms to take the action that they did currently.
Right, that's a great question, and it actually picks up where I would have wanted to add in because yeah, I think Genevieve used the word that I think of first when it comes to the issues of speech, free expression, and deplatforming, and that's the word power. We have, you know, you gave the definition of you know, kind of First Amendment rights to kick us off, and it was expressly created to limit the power of the government. And deplatforming, whether, I love the historical examples that were given. Some of them I didn't even know, they're fantastic. But some were private, most of them were private entity examples. You had a government example there as well. But it really is about who has the power to decide when and how people speak. And right now, the decision around deplatforming, whether it was Donald Trump or others on these social media platforms, the power lies with the platforms. And I think that's by design, based on how our laws are constructed right now. And when you think of the power that they hold, you also have to think about what their motivations are as the entity holding that power. Platforms, certainly at the beginning of the interactive web, 25 years ago, probably did view themselves as a space where they could promote new communities, interactivity, more democratized speech, and we as a society celebrated them for that. But as they've developed their business models over time, there is a bottom line motivation to, especially the more dominant digital platforms, where they want to promote keeping you on their platform because it feeds their business model of collecting data. And so while there's been, I think, false accusations around whether or not they're motivated by politics and whether they moderate content based on ideology, I don't think that's true. And I think the studies have proven that not to be true. But what they do actively promote is virality, trying to keep people coming and staying for content. And that means often content that is controversial or creates debate or creates outrage even. So I think that's why it took a while for them to act, because they had power, they have a motivation to keep people on the platform, and that controversial and sometimes outrageous content or harmful content even can sometimes drive traffic and drive eyeballs to stay on the platform. The important thing is that we have a balance to that power when it's necessary, and I think we're seeing that need to rebalance the power now. And how to do that in light of the depowering of the government through the First Amendment is really a lot of the debate in front of us.
Oh, that's great. And we're going to get to this question of rebalancing power. But yeah, your answer kind of hit on all the big things: politics, ideology, bottom line, motivation, virality, right? We're just going to springboard. So before we go to sort of a broader discussion of sort of potentially how one rebalances the power, I'd love to ask each of you as individuals or, as your organization's representatives, did you think it was the right path for the deplatforming in particular of the former president to happen? And I know it's not always an easy yes or no question, but to the extent that you can speak to it, I'm gonna I'll go ahead and start with Ben, and then everyone can comment.
Sure, and I think my thinking about this continues to evolve. One thing that has remained steady throughout is that Twitter's deplatforming of Trump is very funny. I know that's not really what you're asking, but it's just very funny. I mean, here is a guy who's completely addicted to this way of communicating without any kind of mediation, who's all of a sudden cut off. And I'm amused to think about it. As someone who was blocked by Trump long before he was president, I'm happy in that sense to see the shoe on the other foot. Look, this may be a little bit contrarian. Here I'm speaking for myself and not for the ACLU. I think there was a real value to having Trump on the platform, even when he was consistently violating Twitter's terms of service and creating some harms in the world. I think we would have seen a very different Trump if the only version of him that we saw was one that was mediated through public relations professionals in the White House. And I think the fact that we all got to see him as his true self multiple times a day may in fact have contributed to the largest vote against a sitting president in the history of this country. It certainly provided evidence for us to use in lawsuits against him when Trump would make a decision like the Muslim ban for clearly racist reasons, and the government would come in with a pretextual argument in court, and we could point to lots of tweets that made clear what the real reason was, and that worked until we got to a Supreme Court that didn't care. But I do actually think that Twitter could defend its decision on normative grounds for why it should apply a double standard to someone like Trump, whose violation of the terms of service was newsworthy in many respects. I also completely understand why on January 6th, they said, we have had enough. The election is past, the harms are now concrete in a different way. And, the hell with this. I thought that their explanation for the permanent ban was not particularly persuasive on that day, but we all know that they were just sick and tired of being associated with this, particularly when it reached the point where we saw, blood in the streets. So I'm not giving you a yes or no answer. Do I think that the decision was correct? I think it was understandable. I think their decision before was also understandable. And as we're going to get to over the course of this conversation, I'm very apprehensive about a small handful of people, not particularly diverse in their origins and life experience, having this much power over the boundaries of our political discourse.
Thanks so much. No, if it was a yes or no answer, we probably wouldn't need to have this webinar. I mean, that's what makes this interesting. Chris or Genevieve, do one of you want to go ahead? Go ahead. Okay, Genevieve and then Chris. We'll do it that way.
So I really like Ben's answer. I agree with a lot of it. I also thought that Trump's tweets prior to January 6th could be extremely revealing. I think the thing that's so complicated and difficult to make sense of during the Trump era is that I thought it was a period of so much lying, so much misinformation, and also so much truth-telling through maybe unintentional truth-telling. But there were all kinds of truths about the American political system and about Trump himself, I think, that were revealed during this period, in part because so much of the communication that Trump engaged in with the public was unmediated. There weren't PR handlers. He was so much himself. And so you could see, it was often what was revealed was terrible and horrifying, but it was bracing and interesting to have such direct engagement with it. But I think there are two dimensions that we should really worry about these kinds of tweets, and why I think it was good that the social media companies deplatformed Trump, at least for now. I'm not at all sure about a permanent ban, but for now. And so the one is, it seemed very likely, given the circumstances and the context after January 6th, that his speech would lead to further violence. And I think this actually, I think the issue of deplatforming raises all kinds of questions about the First Amendment standards when it comes to incitement, because I, for one, am very uncomfortable about having two different standards in different domains. Not fully committed that we always have to have uniform standards, but I think we all felt that there was something, or the social media companies understandably felt there was something very dangerous about his speech, even if it wouldn't satisfy the very high specific intent requirement that is required for it to constitute incitement under sort of First Amendment rules, under the important case Brandenburg v. Ohio. And so I think on those grounds, Twitter and Facebook were well justified in deplatforming him when he had such a ready and angry audience. Now, that justification is context specific, so it's not enough to support a permanent ban necessarily. Conditions might change, making his speech much less dangerous, in which case I think we have all kinds of questions that we can ask about the deplatforming decision. And then second, also I think raising all kinds of questions about modern First Amendment law, as well as this question about content regulation on the platforms, is the lies, the constant lies. So as I said earlier, I think there was a lot of truth-telling during the Trump era, but there was also just a huge amount of lying, and lying that was really successful in convincing huge numbers of people that there was, for example, serious fraud with the election. And those kinds of lies are very destabilizing. And so I think on those grounds as well, the social media companies were justified in acting. More generally, though, the question about what do we think about lies, how do we regulate lies, is a question I think we all have to grapple with. But like Ben, I understand, although not without misgivings, what the social media companies did.
Okay, thanks. Chris?
I'll try to keep it simple and straightforward, because I think that's what you were looking for. Did they do the right thing on the 6th and deplatforming Trump? Absolutely. To Ben's point, can you understand, or better yet, were they correct in waiting that long? I think the answer is no. The platforms were not correct in waiting that long. Many of the harms that are cited in the deplatforming from January 6th were happening on a smaller scale. and impacting other communities greater than say just the Congress or what everyone could watch on the news or on live television. You know, whether you want to talk about the increased rates of hate crimes that were being recorded and tracked by multiple groups. There was a public conversation going on, including the platforms, for months before January 6th happened. And so I think there was information to lead to some level of deplatforming, or at least more stringent content moderation by the platforms before we got to January 6th. So I would argue that they were slow to act, but they were correct to act. It shows that the only power check right now on the platforms, which is public opinion, public outrage, was not enough to protect people who were being harmed, physically harmed by the outrage being generated by Donald Trump and some of his allies, and that's frightening. You know, would it have prevented people from being killed on the 6th? I don't know, but to say that there wasn't violence coming from some of the content coming from Trump and his supporters before that, I think misses some of what was happening in the months prior.
Thank you. I appreciate that context. So I see that some questions are starting to come in. And before we turn to them, I do want to broaden the discussion a little to talk about sort of established pieces of the framework. And one is that, you know, a very small group of people holds a lot of power. And so this leads to sort of the question of the moment, which is about you know, regulation or content moderation. And there's a whole host of ways that people are talking about this, right? Whether it's 230 or doing what the EU is doing, or, you know, whether it's an oversight board or a federal agency. And so I'd love to ask each of you to sort of speak to whatever piece of that you would like. And Chris, since you've gone last, I'll let you go first, and
Sure.
Then we'll go Chris, Genevieve, and Ben.
Well, so public knowledge, we've been advocating for creating more choices for consumers that before we think about, and there are folks who are suggesting that we should rethink about how the First Amendment is applied. To me, I think there are steps we can take before considering that, because that would be an extreme constitutional change. And so we look for creating competition and choice for users in the marketplace to make the power of the individuals and of the public stronger. You know, yes, I think that means regulating digital platforms. There's a number of proposals out there. Some of the ones we're championing are to promote choices in the marketplace so that folks who don't like how a platform moderates, they have choices they can move to. We think interoperability rules at a new digital regulator would be helpful to promote that sort of choice in the marketplace. Right now, there's a barrier for users to move to platforms because of the network effects of large social media platforms. The idea that if your friends are on it, that you feel the need to be on it too, if you want to communicate with them in the way we do in the 21st century. And so interoperability would give you the opportunity to move to other platforms and still have that link and that communication, hopefully access to data in your social graph that would make that possible. But yeah, pro-competition rules like that are things we're in favor of. And I would say, as well as looking, I think there's work to do to look at some of the consumer or public interest harms that come with big platforms as well, whether it's in their use of algorithms to promote virality. I think it would be great to have oversight of some of those algorithmic decision-making decisions to make sure that they aren't propagating fraud or civil rights abuses or other types of harmful bias. And to do that, we need an agency with the expertise in digital platforms to do that. So that's why we call for a digital regulator to have the agility and the expertise to enact these sorts of rules where Congress doesn't have that same sort of speed or agility when it comes to innovative new technologies.
Okay. Fascinating. Thank you. And speaking of algorithms, I'm going to give a shout out to the ACLU podcast on liberty. They just did a great one with Sophia Noble on algorithms of oppression. So I recommend that. Definitely insightful. Okay, Genevieve.
Okay, great. So I would be in favor of pro-competition reforms. I think there's just no question that there's the need for a lot of pro-competitive changes to the marketplace, including interoperability requirements. But I don't think that's going to be enough, because a lot of the problems we're talking about are problems where everyone can consent to participate in a speech environment, and it can still have tremendous negative externalities for society. So you might think people could sign up and they really want to get this election disinformation. They think it's great, it's part of their sort of political identity, and then they're going to spread it to their friends and family. We might think that that's going to cause all kinds of problems, even if they have free choice, the market is operating competitively, they have lots of different platforms they could go to, but they're going to the ones where there's just a lot of disinformation or hate spewing. And so I guess this is my time to say something a little contrarian, which is I don't actually think it would require such a profound rethinking of the First Amendment to imagine a system in which the platform power was constrained to some degree. Now, there's a lot of discussion about 230, and I thought I seem to be the one who's bringing history a lot. So let's just think about 230 in a historical perspective. So the way in which we have historically treated private speech platforms is we've done two things. So one, we tend to immunize them against civil liability for defamatory speech that flows on the platform in order to enable them to host speech without having to investigate each instance before it flows through the platform. But in exchange for that boon, we have imposed obligations on them. So with the telegraph and the telephone companies, very strict non-discrimination obligations. Even when it comes to radio and television broadcasters, there's a requirement that they provide access to federal political candidates without discrimination, but then they are immunized against defamation liability. So you get a benefit and you have a constraint. And this is the way in which we work with these private actors who are operating for all intents and purposes as the governors of really important speech platforms. Section 230 has one part of that. It immunizes the platforms from civil liability and certain kinds of state criminal liability for the speech that flows on their platforms, but it doesn't impose any constraints on them. So it's just a win-win for the platforms. It gives them to some degree unconstrained power. And the idea was that this would encourage them to be good Samaritans of speech, to regulate in a thoughtful way. But of course, why should we trust these commercial for-profit companies, even if they're acting in good faith? As Chris suggested, they have very strong profit motives that are going to be guiding their decisions. And we may think that those profit motives are not the same as the kinds of democratic interests that we want a mass public sphere to promote and to protect. And so I do not want to leave. So if I were to reform 230 or to rethink the regulation of the platforms, I would not want to have a system where some of our most vital speech forums, the rules of the road for those really important sites of public expression are determined by non-transparent private actors. And so I think that we are at a moment now where it's time for the government to step in to set basic obligations to ensure that there's not excessive censorship, to ensure maybe along the lines of what the EU is doing, some kinds of basic transparency obligations and due process rights to users of the platforms, and to start thinking in a non-discrimination frame, perhaps, about what are the obligations we want to impose on the platforms. Now, obviously, there would be like 6 seconds after that bill was enacted, a First Amendment challenge, because right now, the court has interpreted the First Amendment to impose very strong constraints on the ability of government to meddle with editorial discretion, the ability of private actors to engage in content moderation or content regulation. But the court hasn't always interpreted the First Amendment to give a blank check to private actors, no matter what role they play in the marketplace of ideas, to make whatever choices they want. From the 1940s, 50s, 60s, in cases like Marsh v. Alabama, the Associated Press case, the Red Line case, the court recognized that there might be the possibility that different private actors play a different role in the marketplace of ideas, and that the First Amendment rights of listeners as well as speakers are protected and matter too. And therefore, in fact, the First Amendment might provide authorization or justification for federal regulation when it is healthy, vibrant marketplace of ideas, not restrain it. And so there would have to be fights about the meaning of the First Amendment, but I also think those fights are overdue. The laissez-faire First Amendment we've had for 4 decades now produces a result where the only thing we can hope for is that corporations are going to act nicely. And that doesn't seem like an ideal result in a democracy.
So that's very interesting. And I would love to talk to you much more about this at length offline. I think though, but my first response to this, of course, we're all in favor of more transparency and more due process. When we start talking about the government actually setting content guardrails, what strikes me is that we're having this conversation, just a few weeks after Trump stopped being president, Barr stopped being attorney general. Before him was Jeff Sessions. The Republicans controlled, the Senate, much of the judiciary. And so I have a hard time separating the standards from the decision maker. It's like that old line, in theory, there's a difference between theory and practice. In practice, there isn't. In practice, it would have actually been the Trump administration that was filling in the blanks that you just left for us. And I think, while I share a lot of the frustrations that you expressed with what you call the laissez-faire First Amendment and some of the results that it produced, I think that I'm more worried that the situation could be worse and would not necessarily be better if we started to tinker with it. And I think part of my difficulty in this conversation is that I'm more of an expert on what constrains results and more of a novice on what might actually produce them. I do want to say I endorse much of what Genevieve and Chris said about monopoly and competition, but I have very, very little to add to it because it's outside of my lane. I will also say that we are having this conversation as if we're talking about tech companies, but I really think we're talking about a few tech companies and not tech companies writ large. I really think we're talking, when we're having this conversation about speech, we're really talking about Google and Facebook and Twitter, to some extent, Amazon to the extent that it hosts the internet, but we don't really care what the speech rules are for a small enthusiast community, a social network for people who are interested in vintage cars. If they want to have whatever rules they have for comments, I don't think any of us would have any objection to whatever rules they want to make. The reason why we're having this conversation about YouTube and about Google and about Twitter is because of how important those private decisions are on actually setting boundaries of what is proper legal debate. But I see Genevieve wants to get back in, and because I'm more interested in what she has to say than what I'm saying right now, I want to yield the floor.
Well, I mostly wanted to speak just to say I completely hear the concerns. I think that when we are thinking about speech regulation decisions, this is my mantra, we should be equally worried about the abuse of private power and the abuse of government power. We should not be naive and think that, oh, well, we just give it to government and then everything's going to be great because the government is a nonprofit actor. I mean, I think one of the truths that the Trump era demonstrated was how, in fact, allegations of lying or fraud can be so used for partisan political gain, right? I mean, Trump himself was a terrible liar, and he was also always complaining that the media was lying. It was all fake news and there was election deception. And so the Trump era makes me very wary about having any kind of simplistic, say, ban on lies, because you could, in Trump's hands or in Barr's hands, you could easily imagine that being weaponized to terrible effect. But I do think that this is an opportunity for us to start thinking really hard about institutional design and how we might imagine a kind of independent agency, or who should be the actors that are making these kinds of decisions if we're wary of private power and wary of government power. And I'm just a little worried. I think it's happening, actually. I think the historical circumstances are pushing us to a point where this is the conversation that is bubbling up. But I think it's happening in a kind of somewhat against, despite itself manner, because there's this view that the First Amendment just imposes very strong constraints on what we can do. And I just want to say the First Amendment is primarily designed to create and sustain the conditions of democratic self-governance. I mean, that has historically been how it's been understood, and that is certainly what the modern First Amendment has been understood. And so if our doctrinal rules are in fact undermining the possibility of democratic self-government, then we should change them, and we should feel like we have the power to reimagine and re-theorize the First Amendment. There is kind of a constitution fetish where people think that the Constitution just comes from down, from up high, and we are bound by its terms, and the America is just exceptional and there's nothing we can do about it. I love the First Amendment. I write about the First Amendment. I teach the First Amendment. I think about the First Amendment all the time. But I love it because I think of it as a really powerful mechanism of facilitating and engaging democracy. And I worry that our current rules are actually undermining that aim. And so to the extent that they are, we need to really rethink them.
Sorry, can I jump in, Michelle?
Yeah, jump in. I was just going to say, Chris, I want you to jump in.
Well, there's so much here that's challenging and overlapping. I love a lot of what Genevieve had to say about going beyond the pro-competition regulations as suggested. And I think it can be compatible with what I was suggesting around competition rules, because I think there's room for, especially if there was a digital regulator, I think there's room for having both a mission around preserving a market for choice in digital platforms, as well as protecting speech or protecting the users of technology in a way that follows a public interest model. So fighting disinformation, the transparency that you spoke of. And I think there are proposals coming out around that actually do it without losing some of the strong parts of Section 230. I don't even know how much you need to touch Section 230 necessarily to engage in some of that. The Bipartisan PACT Act that was proposed but not passed by senators on the Commerce Committee, Senator Schatz and Senator Thune, while not perfect, goes down that road of keeping the free expression protections of Section 230, which are at its core, but bringing accountability and transparency to platforms. We've suggested that there should be some kind of principles around this sort of both free speech and 230 reform, where we take into account the protection of minority voices, where we take into account the size of the platform, as Ben was saying. Our first question when we think about digital regulator is, so who falls under its jurisdiction? And we've suggested at times that maybe there needs to be a dominance test before certain triggers on regulations are pulled against certain companies. So I think there's room for that sort of debate, but it needs to be done in a way that really looks carefully at the marketplace and with an expertise and understanding how each of the different platforms work, because digital platforms are designed differently. Let's put it that way. That sounded really, really basic. But the way that a YouTube works is set up differently than the way that a Facebook works, which is set up differently than a dominant digital platform like Amazon. And so a level of expertise is needed to understand how non-discrimination would work on those different platforms. But I think we're heading in kind of similar directions there, as long as we're trying to preserve the free expression principles that 230 was founded on. And hopefully that can be done without rethinking the First Amendment. Hopefully that can be done by empowering choices in the marketplace for people and promoting public interest values that are being harmed right now, whether it's around voter information or whether it's around the need for trusted sources for fighting disinformation, like local news journalists, which we've proposed.
Genevieve, Ben, anything else before I kind of piggyback on what Chris was saying about disinformation? Okay, I mean, I do think I want to take a minute to sort of turn to this idea of disinformation. And, we're talking today largely to an audience of folks who are affiliated with higher education, right? And I think there is this question of what should educators, individuals, companies, and governments be doing to help people discern, right, what they're consuming and learn about how it's being fed to them, right? Because there are these algorithms and platforms. And so I don't know if folks have any thoughts on what you would say to higher educators or to others generally about how we discern fact from fiction and learn digital literacy. Anybody?
Well, I think it goes beyond digital literacy. I think digital literacy is one tool in the toolbox, and certainly an important one. Those of us who grew up watching, television or cable TV, had to learn to understand when we're being sold through advertising. On an interactive platform like the internet or social media platforms, I think there's some educating that needs to be done about how they are selling us to keep them on the platform. I think that's where oversight of algorithms can help and can be done in partnership with a federal authority. So education, yes. Oversight, absolutely. I think you have to pair the two. And then there needs to be some work done to. I think there should be skin in the game from the dominant platforms where you're seeing disinformation spread. It's being spread on social media. It's being spread on YouTube. It's being spread on cable television, and it would be great to see greater investment or systems set up to give some money from social media or dominant digital platforms to fight disinformation more than they're doing right now. So we've talked about investing in local journalism, which certainly feels like it has been impacted by the changing in the ad market as it's gone online. And so there's an opportunity there to take the skills of journalists and invest in them as trusted sources of news. I don't think that's a silver bullet either. So we have to take these in pieces and see how many tools we can come up with to change the understanding and the structures around what is a powerful interactive tool, the internet.
I would just add here, I think, there's some resonance that we're having this conversation in the week that Rush Limbaugh died. And just to pick up on a point that Chris made, I think these conversations tend to be extremely internet focused. We think that the internet created these problems, and if we just figure out how to regulate the internet, that's going to solve the problem. And I think that the America that we live in today is much more a product of Rush Limbaugh and Rupert Murdoch than it is of Mark Zuckerberg. And that's not to say that Facebook doesn't have an important role to play. It can amplify, it can magnify some of the real tribal nature of our identities and our politics. But when you watch some of these stories, right, the story of whether Barack Obama was born in the United States or in Kenya, that Donald Trump promoted for all these years, right? I don't think that most of the people who spread that story cared whether it was true or false, or were persuaded by it because they heard it. It was part of a broader tribal delegitimization of the president. In the same way that when I saw on my social media feeds that without really any thinking, whatever the latest story from whatever outlet that said that Trump was a Russian stooge, it showed up, it would be amplified 100 times, not because people had read it carefully and decided that story was true, but because it fit their conclusion that they already had about who Trump was and what he represented. So I think this is a really deep problem. And again, I think that there are parts of this that are very much about the internet, how people go down YouTube rabbit holes and really become radicalized in particular kinds of communities. And we can talk about that and how Google should do a better job with its algorithm. But I don't think that that we should focus all of our attention on a few social networks when we're trying to understand how America is what it is in 2021.
And can I add to that? Because I agree with both what Chris and Ben said. So I guess I resist a little bit the framing that this is about digital literacy. Because of course, in part it's about literacy, but I think as Ben suggested, it's about a deep problem of polarization. I just think sustaining collective and shared truth at a period of profound partisan divides is incredibly difficult. And of course, there are things educators can do. Basic skills of critical thinking and forcing students to confront the other side of the argument to whatever they are making is an important tool. And for example, and something I try and do when I in my own social media consuming habit. So in my Twitter feed, I try and have voices of people who I totally disagree with, but then I'm always unfollowing them because I just find it too difficult. I really just want to have my biases confirmed. It's so much more pleasurable. And then I bring them back in. So it's not really about, I don't think it is so much about literacy. I think it's about polarization and the difficulties of truth. And it is a problem that is produced, as both Chris and Ben suggested, not just on the social media platforms, but I think Fox News is a huge problem. But I think we don't want to deal with that because it's harder to think about what to do about Fox News. It's so much more like a traditional media player that we think of as hands-off than the platforms that are really doing a kind of quasi-governmental thing. And so I think for educators as well, and as an educator myself, I find this very difficult, but creating thoughtful, careful discussion across partisan and polarized divides is a really important skill to give to our students. But I also think that it's increasingly difficult given the sort of political context.
And Michelle, let's remember where this conversation started. We were talking about deplatforming. Various forms of content moderation, with deplatforming being one of the more stringent ones, can be used to help fight this disinformation that people are, I think Ben is right. They're purposefully trying to spread, or they may not believe it, but they find an ideological or some other reason to spread it around. There are ways that platforms can reduce how accessible some of that content is without completely eliminating it, if they choose to. The PragerU lawsuit was really about that, that they weren't deplatformed or they weren't censored, but they were deprioritized. And so you could only find their content if you were just looking for it and it wasn't promoted on the social media platform. There's been multiple accusations of censorship when all that Twitter or Facebook was doing was tagging information as incorrect and putting out correct information. And then there's outright deplatforming. So there's multiple tools in the toolbox for the platforms themselves. And we need to support that rather than accuse them of censorship when they engage in those sorts of tactics.
Although, can I just say, Chris, I agree, although at the same time, I think our conversation about partisan divides and your point about how this isn't just about social media companies, I think it also points to the cost of deplatforming. So one of the costs of deplatforming is that some of the social media companies are going to deplatform, say, far-right speakers because they're spreading misinformation and inciting violence, and they're just going to go to another platform. And I would hate if the result of deplatforming decisions is an even more segregated mass public sphere in which one side is only speaking to itself and the other side is only speaking to itself. I think one of the interesting things about Twitter is how it really has been historically a place where very politically engaged people from all partisan affiliations engage. That has caused all kinds of problems. It's also a great virtue of the platform. So the tool of deplatforming as a tool of exclusion can also have tremendous negative consequences, I think, for the health of the democratic marketplace.
I think that's a fair concern. Yeah, and I wouldn't suggest that the idea of interoperability and having traffic be able to move from one platform to the other is a total solution. But I wonder how solutions like that can contribute to bringing some seamlessness between different platforms that people choose to use.
Yeah.
I really appreciate everyone's framing of the conversation, that we're way beyond digital literacy. You're right, and that we're really talking about the issues of truth and who's making these decisions. So I would love to keep hearing you all talk, but I feel incumbent to turn a little bit to the Q&A to our participants who have been patiently waiting. So I'm going to start with a question that has to do with, it says, is it the case that misinformation is more prevalent on the right in conservative circles and sites? Asymmetry is an empirical fact. How can regulation remain above the partisan polarizing fray?
Well, this is one reason why the social media companies didn't want to act sooner. For-profit companies hate seeming like they're partisan actors, especially given all the allegations about anti-conservative bias on the platforms. Not to go back to history, but we saw in the 30s, the radio stations faced with sort of similar but less egregious problems also really were very uncomfortable about what to do because they hated being seen as partisan. So I think it's impossible. I think any reasonable regulation of speech, given underlying social dynamics, is going to seem partisan, in part because everything the government does is partisan, and that's just one of the challenges, I think.
It's unfortunate that there are some who, I think, yes, we are, you can document it, you're seeing more disinformation coming from the right. That may not always be the case. But the folks who are fighting the moderation around that disinformation right now are not only claiming that there's bias, but they're claiming that social media platforms somehow need to moderate in a way that is ideologically neutral. And as if truth takes an ideological position, I think that's not nonsense. Making content moderation decisions is not neutral on its face. It's a choice, and hopefully the choice is in promoting facts and not lies.
And just to go back to history that's a little bit more recent than the 1930s, remember in 2016, Facebook was worried about the criticism it was receiving from Republican members of Congress about how it had a liberal bias, and it hired a bunch of Republican lobbyists, and it tweaked its news feed to favor right-wing sites in advance of the 2016 election. And of course, it's not lost on anybody that it was on the day that the Democrats won the Georgia elections and essentially consolidated power in Washington that the moderation kind of went in another direction. We saw Trump getting kicked off and Parler being deplatformed by infrastructure companies, right? So none of this is going to be immune to what the partisan pressures of the day are. And that's why I think it's really important for us to advance neutrality as a normative value where it's possible to do that. Otherwise it's just going to be who is the sort of strongest at lobbying the companies to moderate in the way that favors, one side of a political debate.
Okay, thank you. Another question has to do with the platforms like Reddit, which this person is arguing have more of a decentralized model of content moderation, and whether that fits into the discussion for 230 reform. Does that address any of the concerns that have come up, kind of how they're modeled? I don't know if anybody has a thought.
Well, so I'll just say something. So I'm not an expert on Reddit. I don't know, maybe Reddit is great, but there is an effort by a lot of the platforms, because on the one hand, they don't want to be speech police. They don't want to be attacked as overly partisan. On the other hand, they don't want to be seeming like they're doing nothing. So there has been this move to empowering users to be more active at regulating. So Twitter has a new feature about flagging. Flagging has always been like a primary tool of content moderation. And it's a means of sort of trying to make the users do it themselves. And again, I'm just really skeptical of this as a model along the same, or at least as a sufficient model. I don't know if it really changes much, because there might be all kinds of bad content. First of all, flagging and user-generated content moderation is also subject to all the kinds of partisan problems and sort of enemy warfare, guerrilla warfare tactics that any other form of content moderation is. We've seen on Wikipedia, lots of horror stories about people using their tools as editors to do achieve all kinds of political ends with content moderation. And second, we might think that there's all kinds of speech that no one is flagging that's still really harmful, because everyone who's participated in that speech environment thinks this is great. Let's just talk about how the election was stolen. And yet that is still changing people's hearts and minds in destructive ways. So basically, I think no, but maybe someone who knows more about Reddit will tell me I'm wrong.
I mean, I feel like I know a little bit about Reddit, and just like enough to be dangerous. What I do know is they years ago had accusations of really, really harmful content, sexism and other things happening, and bullying happening on their platform, and they've been working to clean it up. How well they've cleaned it up, I'm not sure. I'm not a heavy Reddit user, but they've set clear rules. Talking about transparency, they set clear rules. They don't have an army of content moderator forces, but they have their users do it in partnership with the organization, is my best sense of it. And another noteworthy thing about it is that they don't monetize data in the same way that Facebook does. And so they're not driving for virality in the same way that Facebook is, and trying to keep you looking at more controversial content and more controversial content. And I think that's a noteworthy difference. I sound like a broken record, but coming back to the idea of having a regulator with the expertise of understanding the difference between these different platforms is important. Perhaps there are things that, by studying the difference between the platforms, we can learn from Reddit about different business models and where they've been successful and where they haven't been successful in fixing what was really an ugly community for a while.
So I sort of can't believe that we're coming to like our last 5 minutes. I mean, clearly this should have been a 2-hour webinar. And I think what I'd love to do is hopefully ask that we can do this again in like 6 or 12 months and see where we are. But what I'd like to do is just give each of you another minute. Is there something either you want to reiterate, something that we weren't able to touch on, a question for the audience members to think about as we sort of wrap up today? And I'll let you just kind of decide the order. Or I'll have Ben go first, or Genevieve go first.
Sure. I mean, this has been an incredibly rich conversation, so I'm so grateful to have been included and look forward to continuing it both here and offline with my co-panelists. I will just say I am increasingly curious about what I call the Supreme Court of Facebook's terms of service, this quasi court entity that Facebook set up. It would be easy to dismiss because really all it is doing is deciding whether Facebook's rules have been violated, but they did actually bring in quite an impressive,
Sorry.
No, that's okay, it's COVID life. We all have it. They did certainly bring in an impressive group of thinkers with a wide range of experience, and it's good to see them taking on a question like, should Trump be deplatformed? And I'll just be very curious to see how they approach a question like this. I do share some of the critiques of them that have been made by civil society organizations, that their remit is too narrow, that should this speech be on the platform or not is not always the most interesting question. And how their algorithm works to promote or not promote is a much more interesting question at times and may not be part of what they look at. But I will say, I'm very curious to see the output of that body and to see how that might contribute to this conversation.
Okay, great.
I guess one thing that we haven't really talked about, I think Chris hinted at a little bit, is the business models underlying the platforms. I mean, when thinking about how to improve the quality of speech on the social media platforms, you could think about, direct content regulation and rules requiring, I would definitely be in favor of more transparency requirements and due process, but we could go further and have the federal government limit what's allowed on the platforms or their discretion when it comes to removing speech. But there's another approach, which is to limit their ability to make money off what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, from extracting information from the users and then using it to target speech or to amplify speech in particular ways. Now, we might imagine that would not solve all the problems if the platforms had less ability to target speech to your particular characteristics and predilections, but it might go some of the way to creating more sort of cross-partisan conversation. I would imagine the platforms would fight this kind of legislation tooth and nail, though, because it's going to go directly to their bottom line. But we wouldn't want to leave off the table this deep question about their business model and what the economic logic underlying a lot of this is.
I'll just add, I think the various parts of policy that we've touched on, and we've touched on a lot, just show how difficult a topic this is. And I think it's why it requires expertise. I think I've heard a lot here from Ben and Genevieve that I can agree with. There's some that I have concerns about, and I think need to be handled carefully. And then that's why we want to set up something that, in the public interest, thinks about the importance of what our society needs and how to handle these complex issues carefully. I think if we start with some of the things that I hope, and it sounds like there's a lot of agreement on: transparency, due process, pro-competition rules, I think we can start there and then move forward and continue to dive deeper into some of the harder topics before we do things that people think might approach censorship or approach harming the First Amendment. So that's my suggestion. It doesn't mean that they will be a total solution, but I think they can get us started on kind of low-hanging fruit options and then see what more we need to do.
Well, I want to extend my sincere gratitude to each of you for sharing your expertise and your time. I don't know if you're noticing, but in the Q&A, people are sending their thanks, saying that they want us to reconvene in 6 months. And I also just want to highlight, I'm particularly like this discussion was so rich and robust, and it really highlights, I think, the role of the center to bring brilliant thinkers together to really kind of work through these challenging issues. And I do want to spend a minute just asking people to mark their calendars for some other center upcoming events. March 5th is the deadline to submit applications for the Center's National Fellows Program. You can find all the information on our website. Feel free to reach out to me or the center directly if you have questions. March 23rd, we're going to be having our third Speech Spotlight Live. It's going to be When the University Speaks, What Should It Say? And it's focusing on scholar Sigal Ben-Porath and Dean of Students and VP for Student Affairs, Sari Banks, who's also a Center Fellow. And then you can mark your calendars April 20th and 21st. Between 10 and 12:30 PST. We're going to be having our third annual Speech Matters Conference. We won't be at UCDC in person, but we will be together online. And I'm sure that it will be an interesting couple of hours as we talk about charting the course for campus expression and engagement. And with that, I want to reiterate my thanks and just wish everybody good health and well-being, and see you all soon. Thank you so much.
Bye.